do want to have, you want to go to the PowerPoint slide at the bottom. Okay, then slideshow. All right, now that needs to show. Okay, she puts you as organizer. Show my screen. Should I do okay, here we go. Hello, and welcome to the Pathways to Positive Futures webinar on brain development and trauma through the transition years. We'd like to begin with a few announcements to help with your participation in the webinar. First of all, we'd ask you to move any of your handheld electronic devices, for example, your cell phone or tablet, away from your computer and speakers to increase your audio quality. We also urge you to close any file sharing applications like YouTube or Spotify while you're on the call to reduce interference. If you do experience audio problems, please check your own computer's audio settings, and if you're still having difficulties, please send us a message through the chat function and we'll see what we can do to help. Because of the larger number of participants today, we have muted audience members, but we'll be taking questions throughout the webinar by the chat function of GoToMeeting. Finally, for any questions that you might have, we'll be answering them in the order they are received. So please send us your questions by chat as soon as you can. And if we're not able to answer your questions during the webinar due to lack of time, we'll send you a follow-up email answer. The recording of this webinar will be available at the RTC website, and we will, in fact, give you that link at the end of the webinar. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers today. Dr. Julie Rosenzweig is Professor of Social Work at Portland State University and Mental Health Researcher and Licensed Clinical Social Worker. She's being joined by Jennifer Gerlach, who is a college student at Southern Illinois University in Edwardsville and founder of Active Minds at SIUE. Now, Julie will introduce our webinar.
Welcome, and I hope you're all comfortable out there. Maybe you have a snack, cup of coffee or tea. I'm very excited to be sharing neuroscience with you today, a topic which I'm quite passionate about. So today we're going to be covering some fascinating material about brain development and functioning. Neuroscience has revealed how the brain develops during adolescence and emerging adulthood, and that it's purposefully designed to take on challenges as a way of getting youth ready to take on the tasks and responsibilities in adulthood. Ironically, though, the brain is also very vulnerable during this time. And as we've come to understand more about brain development and functioning, research has also shed new light on the impact of traumatic stress on brain functioning. Understanding each of these, brain development and functioning during transition age and the traumatic stress effects, allows us to improve service design and delivery. This is particularly important because, as we all know, the majority of youth in service systems, mental health systems, juvenile justice systems, and the like have experienced multiple traumatic events. Organizations and service providers who use principles of trauma-informed care will more effectively engage service users and offer services that are more aligned with the needs of youth during the transition to adulthood. Of course, neuroscience is fascinating, but it's only truly useful when it helps us understand the narratives and the stories that individuals tell us. I'm excited today to partner with Jennifer, who can tell you what science can't, and that is how it feels. An individual's narrative of traumatic stress is powerful and should always outweigh science, so I thank Jennifer for her courage to bring her story to us today. Before I discuss the specifics of brain development and traumatic stress, I want to briefly touch on development. There are many ways to describe and understand the developmental tasks that unfold during the time of transition to adulthood. Today I'm using the concept of integration as an underlying theme. Integration is seen both as an outcome and as a process, and I conceptualize emerging adulthood as a time during which individuals are creating a more coherent life narrative, one that can take them forward into their adult lives. The time of transition into adulthood is an opportunity for individuals to reconcile or make meaning of earlier experiences and connect these with their current experiences, and then go on to make choices that increase their readiness for an anticipated future. This is what a transition age is all about and what brains are ready to do. This more coherent narrative weaves together many subplots or storylines to find a more solid sense of self. Integration is also what the brain is striving to do from a biological standpoint. The developmental trajectory of the brain is to bring together discrete parts into a more synaptically integrated, efficient mind-body system. And that's a lot of words that we're going to talk more about as the webinar moves forward. As we update our models of development to include more neuroscience findings and have a more complete understanding, as you see in this graphic, about how nature and nurture work together. This shows us that there's many interactions between genetics and different environmental influences, and that these affect both short-term and long-range outcomes. As researchers study more about the effects of adversity while the brain is developing, we learn more and more about the effects that they have on physical, social, emotional, and cognitive developments, not only during birth through emerging adulthood, but the effects last well into the adult years. One of the most well-recognized studies that supports this model is the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, or ACE, that some of you may know about, which clearly identifies the effects of childhood adversity into adulthood. And now it's time for a brief neuroscience lesson. There's so much to know about the brain, and when I talk about the brain, I'm actually talking and speaking about the brain-mind-body connection. First, I'd like to introduce just a few concepts into the presentation. The brain is what scientists call plastic. Of course, that brings up all sorts of images, but the concept of plasticity simply means that the brain can and does change across the lifespan, both in response to genetics and in response to experience. One way we've seen the brain being plastic is through two processes called proliferation and pruning. Proliferation, or blooming, or exuberance, is the multiplying of synaptic connections, which is very much a part of the adolescent brain development, and pruning away of unused, and then there's the pruning away of unused synaptic connections. This is what we call use it or lose it. Proliferation and pruning are the processes of how the brain architecture is built, or the sculpting happens. Also, myelination is important. It's a process by which brain neurons develop faster and more efficient communication with one another. Myelination continues well into the late 20s and even the early 30s, making it a significant process to understand emerging adulthood. And finally, and perhaps the most important, is adaptation. The brain is very adaptive, constantly reading and responding to its surroundings. Adaptive capacity is central to the adolescent emerging adult brain. And I'll refer to these concepts throughout the rest of the presentation so you'll get a better sense of what they really mean and how they look. Neuroscience emphasizes what's called head flow, and that's called neurons that fire together, wire together. Experience, including early relationships, cause neurons to fire, and experiences, including traumatic experience, literally shape the brain. In fact, we know that traumatic experiences actually change how the genes look. So this is your brain, beautiful and complex, and unfortunately none of us ever really get to see this, but trust me, it's there. Even if you've never heard or studied about or studied neurobiology, terms of narratives and in terms of biology, integration across hemispheres is key to that process. For example, when something very emotional happens, we register those feelings in the right and then go to the left to find words and symbols to describe and make meaning of those emotions. We often think of our neocortex as the most important part of the brain. Those are those squiggly wigglies you see on top of the brain here. But looking at the picture, you see that size isn't what is important. The structures in the center of the brain are the power players, control central. If we don't feel safe in our environment, it's hard to think. The amygdala is a small almond-shaped structure, of which there are two, one in each hemisphere, and that's key to our survival. This is our feeling center. This is the place where we register fear and is responded to by our body in the terms of fight, flight, or freeze. This is where we register trauma. Trauma is registered first as a threat to our survival. Next to the amygdala is the hippocampus, or Latin for seahorse. It's key to our learning and memory. The structure is particularly very vulnerable to traumatic stress. When exposed to toxic stress for long periods of time, a chemical called cortisol is continually present and it has been shown to actually shrink the volume of the hippocampus, damaging the typical growth of the neurons. If we just pause for a minute and look at the memory system, it's very important to understand both in terms of how we manage our day-to-day experiences and the role of trauma. We actually have two memory systems, one implicit, one explicit. Your explicit memory system is the one that you're aware of right now as you're frantically trying to remember everything that I'm saying. And you are also aware of wanting to remember. That's what makes it explicit. Now, if you're trying to multitask, you're not remembering very well because your memory system doesn't really work very well that way. However, your implicit memory system is quite different. It's the only one online at birth for almost the first 2 years and continues to function and record without your awareness throughout your life. This is your trauma recorder. It records sensory information, storing it to keep you safe. This is one of the primary reasons while individuals with traumatic stress experiences have what we call flashbacks. That's what happens when we talk about triggers or activation cues. It's your implicit memory system trying to keep you safe. The final part of the brain I will include today is the prefrontal cortex, or the PFC. This is a part of the brain that is the focus of executive functions and emotional regulation. This is the area that's last to receive myelination, as I mentioned, well into the 20s or perhaps even the early 30s. What does that really mean? Using an internet connection analogy, it's the brain going from dial-up to DSL. On a good day, our amygdala, our hippocampus, and our PFC are integrated and speaking to each other. These are the important pathways of integration. So just as I mentioned that there's integration across hemispheres, there's also important integration from the center part of the brain to the outer part of the brain, particularly the prefrontal cortex. And as you can see from this diagram, it really talks about how information comes into our system. First, verbally and non-verbally. Without our awareness, the body cues us whether or not there is threat in the environment, and then that threat is screened through the amygdala before we're even consciously aware of the information. The awareness is from our thinking processes. This is also known as bottom-up processing. And now that you have a basic understanding of some of the key structures and functions of the brain, you can better appreciate the specifics of the adolescent, emerging, adulthood brain development. The period of development from adolescence through the 20s is very active. Proliferation and pruning are rapidly changing the connections throughout the brain. While some of this is from a genetic blueprint, much of it is influenced by the experiences that any one individual is having. And as you can see from this complex graph, this is one of the few studies that's a longitudinal look at the understanding of the emerging adult brain, and this includes individuals up to age 32. It shows that proliferation and pruning changes the ratio of gray matter, which are the neurons, and white matter, which are the synaptic connections, and the overall volume of the brain. I have to underscore the role of adaptation in understanding brain development. Interestingly, what gives parents and service providers great concern about behaviors of youth are behaviors which are actually developmentally necessary to prepare for adulthood, such as seeking novelty, taking risk, and intense romantic attachment. It's crucial to understand that the developing brain is wired to pursue these activities. In reality, more often than not, it's not the brain but the environment that presents the risk. In a few minutes, we'll continue to talk about the neurobiology of traumatic stress. But now it's Jennifer's turn to share with you her story. Jennifer, welcome, and please tell us what your experiences have been.
Hi, thank you, and I'm glad you all gave me this opportunity. One of the more traumatic experiences I went through in my life, began when I was around 10, and I began just having really weird urges. I began feeling like I needed to bark, needed to laugh, sometimes needed to hiss. I didn't know what was going on, and I thought I might have been going crazy. I had trouble with my friends because of it, trouble in school, and I also began having these weird thoughts, thinking I was doing things wrong, thinking I was sinning, having just really weird rituals to do. I was afraid to make eye contact sometimes, like somehow if I would look someone in the eye and thought the wrong thing, something bad might happen to them. And I knew it wasn't really true per se, but it still really shaped my social behaviors, some of my behaviors at home. My relationship with my family was already not great, and it just continued to go south. So when I got to be around 13, it kind of came to a point where I entered, treatment, and they started wanting me to take medication, and I didn't, and it just kept accelerating from there until eventually one day I was, with a parent, and I was drove out to a building about an hour and a half away from the home. I saw a little wire fence around it. We were buzzed in, and I learned that I was being admitted to a psychiatric hospital for a couple of days. I didn't know anything about going there. I didn't know anything about what hospitals were. I thought that I was going to be there for the rest of my life. I was thinking, about One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And when I was there, I was also starting to think that this confirmed I was crazy. So even though the hospital was a much more positive experience than what I was expecting, it turned out to be a kind of negative and traumatic experience, just in that I didn't know what was going on. I was already in a really kind of unstable state at the point. And so when I went into the hospital, all these things kept jumping out at me. There was this great power difference between the staff and the patients there. Staff had all kinds of control. They had the keys. They decided when you went home. They told you when you were going to get up. They told you, what you were going to do at all points. And that kind of control over me made it that much worse. I also saw a lot of, my peers being overpowered, restrained or sedated, sometimes for reasons that to me didn't seem to merit that, but according to the rules or whatnot would merit that. And, I remember one day seeing my roommate, just talking to her early in the morning, and then, there was some kind of conflict. Staff member wanted her to get up off a chair. He wanted the chair and she wouldn't. And I went to the other room to answer the phone, and then as I was there, I saw two staff members kind of tackle her, pull her out into the hallway, and carry her to the quiet room. Quiet room is a seclusion room, an area where they can kind of keep things toned down and help people calm down. And that girl was given sedating medications. That scared me. That really scared me. I also remember a lot of times the staff talking about where we were going to go after coming to the hospital. A lot of the youth who were in the hospital with me, just because of the nature of the hospital I was in, were there not from the community. Some of them had come from local, correctional or detention centers, and some of them were also there for what may or may not be perceived as deviant behavior. Some of the youth were there for things like running away or getting into a fight, hard drugs. And so I remember this, the staff member kept telling us 80% of us will not go home, and, you know, kind of telling us like scare stories about boot camps and what he called ranches, which I would guess are something akin to a residential treatment center. And I was scared. I was scared that I wasn't going to go home. I was scared that I was going to go to kind of what I had in mind in the beginning when I was put into the hospital. But I did get out. I got out 10 days later. And the whole time I was there, it felt like I was in a dream. You know, I kept thinking, I'm going to wake up and I'm going to realize that this isn't real. But when I got out, that feeling didn't really go away. I still kind of felt like a dreamlike state. And I remember I would shower, you know, over and over just trying to wake up. And it just didn't go away. It felt like there was some kind of bubble just all around me. I felt disconnected from everyone else around me. And it felt like my world was kind of stuck and the rest of the world was spinning. So I had to deal with my condition, which was Tourette's syndrome, but I also had to deal with some of the trauma I experienced, you know, just in going to the hospital and just in things around that. Some of the things that helped were talking. I had a neighbor who was willing to talk to me about my story over and over and over. And even though, you know, sometimes I would add just little details I remembered, just having that experience, being able to tell my story again and again and again helped a lot. Another thing that helped was being able to create a collage. In one of my art classes in high school, we got poetry books, and we could take the poetry out, the books. You can like take a stanza, you know, a little bit, and that's what I did. I used to cut out little bits of the poems and find pictures that I related to and pieces of the poems that I related to. And I put them together into this collage. And that was kind of the first time I was able to sort of express it in a public way, rather than just telling my neighbor, you know, what I was experiencing and some of the thoughts and feelings I was having. And people didn't really know exactly what was meant, but it was meaningful to me to do that. Regaining control was also a big thing to help, and shifting my focus to something positive. In high school, I had a point where I was able to mentor another student, and that helped me remember kind of where I was coming from, some of the good things in my life. And then later on, you know, as I started doing better, I began getting opportunities to speak out and talk about, you know, some of the policies we have, and, you know, what about the restraint policies that we have? Are they really helpful? You know, I got to kind of share my stories and do some writing and do some speaking, and that was definitely meaningful for me. So just to kind of sum it up, some of the things that I think that can be helpful for adults who are working with youth who might be experiencing some trauma or recovering from some trauma, just be first to acknowledge that it is trauma or that it might be tough for the person. My experience wasn't really what people think about when they hear the word trauma, but it still was traumatic to me. Something that might not seem traumatic to one person or might not even be traumatic to one person might be very traumatic to another. So just acknowledging that, validating that can be meaningful. Giving the person some means to express what they're going through can be helpful. They might not feel safe talking about it, especially if it's to do with family, to do with other people. People often want to protect those who hurt them or just want to protect those in their life. But, you know, giving some alternative means of expression, like what I had with the art, can be helpful. Finally, helping people find positive new directions. You know, something new to focus on other than the past can be really helpful. And I think that's what I've got to say.
Thank you, Jennifer. That was such a wonderful story, as bittersweet as it was, because you did something that I can't do talking about neuroscience, and that is really talking about what it's like to live inside and through a traumatic experience as you entered a very strange experience that was meant to help you. And I just, you know, as I'm listening to you, I'm really taking note of so many of the things that you talked about and the dynamics that you talked about that we understand through the lens of neuroscience, but are relevant to many, many different types of traumatic experience in terms of a power differential, physical restraint, fear, threat, observing others being hurt. All of those things are really hallmarks of many traumatic experiences. And then you talk about the feelings that didn't go away and that sense of disconnection, which is very much a mark of traumatic stress. And I love how you talk about putting the pieces together, weaving the coherent narrative through the use of collage, and how you were able to better integrate that. And also speaking of how relationships help you heal, first talking to your neighbor and really narrating it over and over again so that you again can draw all the pieces together. I can see the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere working together, the internal parts of the brain and the thinking parts of the brain and the better emotional regulation. And just that relationship that obviously you had first with your neighbor and I'm sure with others, but then paying it forward and mentoring another youth so that you could also experience the part of a relationship as a buffer. So thank you so much for sharing that story. And what I'm going to do now is talk about what we know from neuroscience that both helps us understand more about Jennifer's and many, many others' experience, both when they experience trauma prior to a hospitalization or, as Jennifer so poignantly pointed out, that the hospitalization in and of itself sometimes can be traumatic. And as we move forward in the field of traumatology, it has continued to expand, and researchers are knowing more and more about what we call traumatic or toxic stress. And for a long time, we just looked at psychological stress focused within the child welfare system, looking at abuse and neglect, or understanding the experiences of soldiers returning from war. And these are still very important topics of research and services, but the field has expanded to include a long list of potentially traumatic events, one of which Jennifer has just talked about. And we put all of those under the concept of adversity. Bruce McEwen is a leading researcher in this arena and has discussed different types of stress and their effects on brain architecture and therefore functioning. And as you can see from this list, when adverse effects in the events can range from anywhere from childhood abuse to living in poverty. All of these can overwhelm an individual's capacity for coping. And when they're not buffered by supportive relationships, as it was in Jennifer's case when she was hospitalized, the brain is compromised, and the physiological response of the brain is a significant sensitivity to stress. In other words, the biology of the brain actually becomes very sensitive to traumatic stress, or what we could call trauma adaptive. So again, I'm using that notion of adaptation. The brain has learned to adapt to a persistent, threatening environment, and that was certainly the case in Jennifer's story. The threat may be real or representative of past threat, remember our implicit memory system, because the #1 job of the brain is indeed our survival, so it goes into survival mode. The effects of prolonged traumatic stress, which is a chemical cascade, is very profound. Think about it this way. The brain is a resource distribution center. Resources go where they're needed most. If the brain needs to be on survival alert, as we heard in Jennifer's story, then those are the structures that will receive the greatest level of resources. As you can see from this list, structures are physically altered to adapt to the environment. Another visual to help us understand. The good news is, and again in Jennifer's story, these are reversible. That's why we talk about neuroplasticity, because the brain can change in response to favorable conditions. And here's another graphic that really talks about the lack of integration when the brain is under stress and adapting to adversity. One of the major shifts is how we talk about traumatic stress, and this is really important and it's central to trauma-informed care. We move away from pathology and thinking that the brain is pathologically affected to really understanding it as an adaptation to any certain environment. So what does the intersection of the developing youth brain and traumatic stress look like? Well, first I'll tell you that it's a very under-researched area. That said, this list of effects of traumatic stress reinforces not only our need for more research, but also to not overlook the occurrence of traumatic stress reactions within the emerging adult population with whom we're interacting. Unfortunately, too often services are designed to only intervene with the consequences of untreated traumatic stress and unrecognized trauma, and not either the co-occurrence or the sequential occurrence of traumatic stress and coping. So a lot of times our services are directed at the criminal activity or the substance abuse problem. There's an African proverb that I like quite a bit that really captures how we need to rethink the role of adversity and traumatic stress in the lives of youth in our service system. Do not look where you fell, but where you slipped. So what does this mean? It means that we need to screen for and address the effects of trauma in conjunction with other behaviors that are bringing youth into our service system. Of course, there are buffers that can lessen the effects of traumatic stress that we need to be aware of. For example, researchers are continuing to look at resiliency. We know that the quality of early and later attachments are of importance, and studies are also looking at the buffers provided by social support, and we certainly saw that in Jennifer's case once she was out of the hospital. It's also important to be very cautious to not overlay dominant culture interpretations of what is traumatic or what are effective interventions, but to learn from indigenous ways of working with traumatic events and cultural-specific healing practices. The knowledge about traumatic stress, especially looking at adaptation rather than pathology, has led to the development of an trauma-informed care perspective. While there's much to say about this, I will only highlight some of the main points. First, when you look at behaviors or you see choices that youth have made, instead of asking what's wrong with you, we now ask what has happened to you. This is part of the practice of what we call universal precaution. We make the assumption that those that we are serving have indeed experienced trauma, and we do everything possible to avoid re-traumatization. And this does mean everything, from looking at our physical space that might be threatening to creating a greater awareness across all levels of an organization to working with staff around vicarious traumatization. Developing a trauma-informed agency is nothing short of taking on major organizational cultural change. It's not just a way of doing. It is a principled relational lens to all the values and levels of an organization. The Community Connections program has identified 5 principles that need to permeate all levels of an organization. And it's the consumer's voice that takes the lead on implementation of these principles. If the process of cultural change is to take hold and an organization is truly to become trauma-informed, then it must partner with service users and integrate and lead with their definitions and lived experiences of safety, trustworthiness, choice, collaboration, and empowerment. And I think we heard from Jennifer that she has a very strong voice to help lead this change effort in many organizations. I see we just have a few minutes left for questions and answers. So we've looked briefly at the neuroscience research that has implications for services aimed at assisting youth in transition. I hope you found this time well spent and are reflecting on the ways this information can make a difference for you and the youth you serve.
Well, thank you very much, Julie and Jennifer, for that great presentation. It's really stirred up a lot of interest, and I would like to thank the audience for being very patient as we worked out our audio problems during this time. I'd like to begin with a question from one of the audience for Julie. Is there a good short screening instrument to help identify young people who might benefit from trauma-informed treatment?
I think the way I'd like to answer that is to refer back to what we do call the universal precaution. And that is to assume that everyone can benefit from a trauma-informed organization, so that we assume that everyone has had some level of trauma experience in their life. And there are some short instruments that are being developed, and what's key to that is that the appropriate staff have the appropriate training to interact around those questions. But it's a great question, and you're definitely in the right direction by asking it.
Julie, also, are there any resources for youth who are not interested in traditional therapy to deal with trauma? And I guess, Jennifer, also, you may want to chime in on that too, because I know you're involved in peer support.
I would love to toss that one first to Jennifer, because I think, Jennifer, you're much more of an expert in responding to that question than I would be.
Sure. I think that peer support is definitely a great, not necessarily an alternative to therapy, but definitely a place where healing can occur. Some of the local support groups, such as the ones through NAMI or DVSA, might help youth who are dealing with challenges related to mental health. There are also other support groups in a wide variety of areas that deal with different challenges related to trauma. On college campuses, there's a group called Active Minds that's kind of centered around mental health, and that might be another place where college students in particular can seek support.
I guess what I would add to that is that I think your expression through the collage as a non-traditional form, it takes on part of art therapy. I think what we know about both traumatic stress and the developing brain during adolescence as well as emerging adulthood is that it doesn't respond terribly well to traditional therapies because it's so actively developing, and it is wanting to try to put together this coherent narrative. So I think non-traditional or art-based therapies, movement-based therapies are certainly very effective. Peer-based therapies, because they give the relational aspects, are very important. And I think I would also reemphasize that, and it's one of the reasons why we're doing this webinar, is that many practitioners and service organizations haven't yet understood the neuroscience behind the emerging brain development or the neuroscience behind traumatic stress, and that those are really key training areas for all organizations to take on, and then creatively think outside the box of traditional therapies in terms of how they can honor those emerging systems.
Okay, thank you very much for that answer. I'd ask both panelists, what are effective ways to help build social connections and trust with traumatized youth in settings that are time-limited or non-clinical? And that's from the audience.
Do you want to take a swing at that one, Jennifer?
Sure. I think that one of the best ways to kind of build trust is to give some room to trust. It might take some time, and allowing the youth to have as much control over their life or the different situations can help them kind of build trust that you might have some good things to give them. So I think, for example, empowering them to try new things, maybe empowering them through youth voice, groups like Youth Move, or areas where they can kind of express what they're feeling. just giving them opportunities, but letting them have those opportunities in their court to make their own decisions, I think can definitely help build trust.
And you can hear from Jennifer's response that she took in all the principles of trauma-informed care: safety, trustworthiness, choice, collaboration, and empowerment. And certainly if we are mindful of that, that's going to go a long way. And just remember that in terms of how the brain works, that even without knowing if an individual has had a prior traumatic experience, and it's a pretty good bet that anyone in a service system has, we just know that from the data, that they've got to feel safe, and safety comes within a relationship, and to not minimize the importance of that, and that that's a good intervention in and of itself, and sometimes we forget to go there first.
Okay, here's a question that involves resources or tools or practices for addressing trauma associated with traumatic health challenges for young people in their early 20s. If you're experiencing a traumatic health challenge, perhaps maybe a brain injury or some serious disease and traumas associated with it, do you have any suggestions for that, tools or practices?
I don't know that I have any identifiable resources, but I'm just thrilled that someone is speaking that a serious health challenge is a traumatic event, and it is something that scientists and researchers and practitioners are understanding more and more. So I think the first step is to recognize it as traumatic and to understand what that does neurobiologically, and then take some cues that Jennifer's offered us and understand that narrating that experience in the context of a relationship or more than one relationship is really an important way for especially someone in their 20s to kind of make meaning out of that and to draw some positives around that and to understand it so that they understand where they're moving forward and how they're moving forward.
Here's a serious issue for both of you. Someone has asked if you have any suggestions for working with clients who are not yet in a place where they're wanting to work on trauma-related issues, yet they're mandated by caseworkers or parole officers to engage in therapy.
Wow, that is a great question, and it really underlies why we're bringing this webinar to everyone today. And that is many service systems are not yet trauma-informed, and kind of that forced engagement into therapy really isn't productive for anyone. I think what you need to do is find advocates in any community that can begin to understand just even the basic principles of trauma-informed care, and there's some great resources. We have a number of them on our reference list that you will all have access to, and just begin to advocate and understand the language of trauma-informed care.
Okay. A follow-up to this. Oh, Jennifer, go ahead, please.
Oh,
Jennifer?
Sorry. I have a couple comments. Oh, sorry. Can y'all hear me?
Please.
I have. Okay.
Speak up a little louder, Jennifer.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes. Thank you.
Excellent. Some comments I have. Just by letting the person work at their own pace. Sometimes a person might not be able to or willing to deal with issues in their past, but they might be willing to work towards some new positive directions moving forward. I think there might be a little bit of a difference between trauma-informed care and maybe trauma-focused care. It's good to know how the trauma impacted a person, but if the focus is on now and the focus is on what's going to be, it's not, I don't think, necessary to make the person go back or make the person reintegrate to something that they're not ready yet to do. And I think it's possible to move forward without necessarily focusing in on the trauma.
And I would definitely concur with that. I think that sometimes we And I know this definitely. As a clinician, I often get asked, do I have to go back? Do I have to remember? What if I can't remember? Can I still heal and move forward? And absolutely, you can heal and move forward without going back and remembering and talking about it. There's a lot of opportunities to heal from trauma and a lot of different ways to heal from trauma.
Okay, thank you very much. Here's another really important question from an audience member. How do you work with youth who will be returning to stressful environments? We do great work with the youth while they're in treatment, but then they return to the trauma-filled home or neighborhood. Are there tools that they can take home with them?
Absolutely, and that's an issue that I think everyone has at different levels that are trying to heal from any number of traumatic events, and they return to an environment that is still pretty threatening. And hopefully the takeaway tools that they have are really focused on emotional regulation. We hear a lot about mindfulness practices and breathing and yoga, and there's so many tools out there that have gotten really good results. So it really is central to have takeaway tools and tools that you can use anytime, any place to help bring you into emotional regulation as you continue to do your work.
Here's a question from someone who is seeking for a source of hope. Is there much hope for youth who have lived with chronic trauma for many years? And how much can the brain normalize after extreme trauma?
That's a great question, and I do want to provide a lot of hope because the notion of complex trauma and developmental trauma is really at the forefront of much of the trauma research, and certainly Bethel Vanderkolk has been our greatest advocate in that direction, that we have tried to actually change diagnoses. Not that I'm a fan of all diagnoses, but he's actually tried to highlight the complexity of trauma and the different layers of trauma. Trauma is a very layered experience. And the good news is that the brain does like to feel integrated. It does like to return and seek its full capacity, and that's what trauma-specific treatment and trauma-informed treatment is all about. So absolutely, with good therapy, the brain can heal itself, and you can make meaning out of even some really significant traumatic experiences through relationships and emotional regulation practices, and any number of therapies can certainly help alleviate the suffering and help the brain to return to its full potential.
Here is a question that goes in a... oh, Jennifer, go ahead, please. Sorry.
Oh, it's no problem. I just wanted to make a really quick comment on that. To quote a woman named Ella Fitzgerald, it isn't where you came from, but where you're going that counts. And so I think regardless of, whether, whatever is going on with a person's, brain, I think that there are ways to come and make new good things, good relationships, good work, There's a lot of new directions a person can walk in that may be completely different from where they came from to begin with.
Okay, thank you. I want to now take this in a slightly different direction. We have questions about supporting and working with the young person's family members. This is obviously really extremely important. And I'm wondering if Jennifer or Julie, you have any specific ideas.
Jennifer, do you want to speak to that? Because you've actually lived through that experience. How were you worked with in relationship, or how was your family worked in relationship to the experiences that you've had?
Sure. I think that when the experience is mental health, and even if another traumatic experience is at play, education can make a great difference. I know some of the local mental health organizations around here offer classes for parents who are dealing or working with a child who has a mental health condition, and just knowing what that involves, knowing what helps, what doesn't help, I think can be extremely helpful. I think it's also helpful for the family to get support themselves. I can only imagine how my illness, affected my family. I've seen it, but I'm not them. So I think that reaching out, having some kind of either support group, good friend, someone to talk about it so you're not dealing with it alone. And lastly, I think that advocacy can be extremely helpful. Realizing what services or what help is needed and then reaching out for that help. So, for example, if a family member needs respite care, say there's a child who needs help, that kind of help, looking out and seeing those resources, and even if you're told those resources don't exist here, keep looking and finding what you need, I think can help to deal with that.
I think that that's just the perfect answer. Of course, many of us are familiar with NAMI. That's a great organization to help include and support families and really break the isolation that can happen so often when families are struggling with all of this.
I have another question about working with community partners. Sarah in the audience has asked, how do we go about educating community partners that we work with so that we can be allowed to provide trauma-informed care? I, as a clinician, can understand how youth behaviors may be adaptive after traumatic experiences, but when I suggest this, I get a lot of eye rolls from folks.
Well, I have to tell you, I do a lot of training in this area, and I've just finished with some other folks a series of training with a number of community partners in this area. And I think when you have people in an audience that are from different organizations and you have multiple members from one organization, really understanding a bit more about neurobiology and how the brain works, I've had a pretty positive response. I think the challenge is taking the information that we know from research and from practitioners that have had success with looking at the adaptive qualities of the brain and really putting it into practice. We know there's always a lag time between the science and the translation or the application of the information. But I would really encourage even small, trainings at, lunch hours or just different forums to begin to talk about the notion of neuroscience, because I think it's here to stay. I don't think it's just trending.
This is a question that relates to Jennifer's experiences. Now, I'd throw this out to both of you. Do you have comments or suggestions around reducing the traumatic nature of being placed in a secure facility when it is not able to be avoided?
It's a great question. Jennifer, why don't you take that first?
All right. I think one of the best ways is to, again, just allow the person to have as much control as possible. So,
could you speak up a little bit, Jennifer?
Sure, of course.
Thank you.
Just allowing the person to have as much control as possible. There might be a lot that they don't have control in that situation, but giving any kind of choices can make it a little easier. Using restraint, seclusion, and sedation as minimally as possible can make it less of a threatening environment. I know that there are places in the state I'm in Illinois, that are trying to go restraint-free now, which is really cool to me. But I do realize that, there are dangerous situations that come up. Sometimes restraint may or may not be necessary. But trying to use it at a minimal can make it feel a little bit safer of a place. Lastly, I think just giving really good information, honest information. A lot of what made my experience challenging was misinformation. For example, being told that 80%, I hear 80% of statistics are false anyway. But hearing that 80% of us weren't going to go home, that scared me. But just giving, the clearest, most honest information about where the youth might be going after this, what they can do and expect when they get home, even if it's not the answer the youth wants, just knowing that they're getting honest information can make it a lot easier to deal with and can definitely make it a little bit more trusting.
I would really underscore everything that Jennifer said, and certainly, you know, understanding that the use of restraint and seclusion and sedation are traumatic events regardless, and they're even more traumatic if you've had a history of trauma that's included any of that, which most trauma has, that we really have to move to almost no practice of that or very extreme limited practice of that. And that takes understanding behaviors very early on before they escalate to a place where that type of practice is needed. But that's really what launched trauma-informed care, was really understanding that seclusion and restraint were re-traumatizing so many individuals in service systems, especially secure facilities.
Well, thank you so much, Jennifer and Julie, for those really great answers. And I realize that we didn't get a chance to answer everybody's questions, but we will try to send some answers through the email system to those of you that have signed up for this event. So in answer to quite a few questions about how can you get today's slides and references, this slide gives you the pathways, path to find the project training slides. These will be posted about 2 days from now, and the slides and the references will be there, and the webinar itself will be there. So it won't just be the slides. You will actually be able to hear it again. A number of you asked, how can I share this with people that I work with? They can listen to it again, and we would be happy to share that with you. The other thing that might be helpful is for you to get in contact with us directly. So you can get our email addresses through this slide, or in fact on our project website. So that will be available for you. And then there are more training opportunities that are coming up. You can sign up for the RTC Updates, which is a monthly email announcement for the latest news and opportunities. Just email us or just sign up at this link, which will also be in the slides. And then also you can watch the RTC Updates for announcements. There's going to be a series of 8 one-hour interactive online training modules called Promoting Positive Pathways to Adulthood that you'll be able to access on your own schedule. It's asynchronous training, so you can do it at any time. It's coming in 2013, and we'll be announcing it through RTC Updates. And then finally, we would very much like to acknowledge the wonderful contributions of our 2 speakers today. Thank you, Julie Rosenzweig and Jennifer Gerlach, for all of the opportunities that you've provided for us to learn about trauma and trauma-informed care. And we'd like to acknowledge our funders and thank you very much for your attendance at this webinar today.
Thank you, everyone.